Morning. What's going on, guys? So second video starts now. As you can see, the Pro is gone. Thank God, frees up a ton of room in here. Today we're going to be diving into the Turbo S, telling you what happened at Hammers, telling you what's going on, what it needs, what's all broken, I guess you would say, which there's a few things. So we'll dive right into it. First things first, what I'm going to end up doing is getting this radius rod back on here. I did end up bending one slightly and twisting it. So ORB, great product. I've had this suspension on the car for roughly 2 years. That one, I mean, has taken a lot of abuse. That's the side, obviously, I can't see. So I tend to place it over rocks that chew it up. I mean, you can tell on this one here. I mean, you can see it's missing chunks of billet. So that one ended up getting twisted. I don't exactly know how. I sent it out on Sunday, I think, last week, and I already received the replacement. A lot of these other channels out there, I mean, they're paid by these guys. You know, they get these parts sponsored to them. So yeah, my goal is to give you guys honest opinions of companies that, you know, are good to work with or offer a great product. So there's going to be no BS. We'll shoot you straight. We'll tell you what works, what doesn't. I mean, that's all there is to it, you know. I mean, I want you guys to have great machines, and I don't want you to waste your time, hard-earned money on stuff that really just doesn't work. So we'll get you set up here. I'm going to get this radius rod on, get this thing on the ground, and then we can start going over a few things that went wrong. But let's get into that right now. Floor's a little slick. Leave myself a little room. If you guys don't have this Badlands off-road jack, this 3-ton, you're sleeping, man. This thing is great. I think it's like $300. I'm sure you've seen it all over YouTube, but it's comparable to the Pro Eagle. Makes life way easier. You don't have to use a block of wood on your other jacks to get this thing off the ground. One nice thing it does have that the Pro Eagle doesn't is this little flip switch right there that locks the handle, so you're able to pivot it by the jack handle. I've used a ton of Pro Eagles. They're kind of a pain in the butt to maneuver. Again, not a dig at Pro Eagle, but man, this jack is good for the money. Should look into it. Okay, so up first, we got this radius rod, brand new billet from ORB. So essentially how these get assembled is you have this bushing that goes in the end. I'll clean them up before I press them in, but you press it in, and then you have a snap ring that goes on both sides, and then that locks it in place, and then it's ready to go on the machine. So we'll get those cleaned up, those bushings there. We'll get it chalked up in the press. I might try to press them via hand tools first, but we'll get those cleaned up. We'll get this installed, and then we'll pick up from there. Just going to use a little brake clean to clean these up. Yeah, hard on the paint, right? If you're going to complain about using or spraying brake clean on the machine, we'll just wait until you see what we do to the rest of it. Anyhow, I'm going to clean these up with a little brake clean. I might spray a little WD-40 or maybe use a little grease or something to help these go in. I mean, they are pretty dirty. I should have got some new ones, but what can you do when it's a warranty claim, right? I mean, I'm just happy that no questions asked. They just always come through and just send me one. I've used my warranty one other time. I ended up hitting a rock in Moab with a lower control arm, dented it real hard. Still rideable. I rode like that. Both their products that I've damaged were rideable both times. They never broke. They never, I mean, I guess you could say they failed kind of, but they never left me stranded or anything like that. I mean, they both just had a dent or a slight bend in them. And I mean, after abuse, I hit a rock doing probably 40, 45. It smoked the A-arm, about made me flip, spun me around, stopped me dead in my tracks. But that was the first claim I ever made. Real easy. Filled out a form, sent the part. New one came 5 days later. Same with the radius rod. So nothing bad to say. But these are coming out pretty good. We'll get them finished cleaned, and then we'll get them pressed in. So one other thing to point out here is they actually have grooves for those snap rings. So you'll know exactly when you get that bushing centered. All right, I did end up putting it in the press. It's just easier this way. I was going to smack it a bunch with a hammer, but I figured this is way quicker and easier. So I got a spare socket, not my good sockets. I got a whole slew of ones that I use for hammering and pressing and just messing them up real nice instead of junking my good ones. So we'll go ahead and press this in. I don't know if this is tightened all the way. Might have pressed it too far. We'll check it out. Need to weld me a lever on there and make that a little bit easier. She go. I don't know if you guys can make that out, but that lip looks pretty good. It's accessible. Same with that one. You can see the grease. We might need to push it just a titch more this way. Yeah, just a tiny bit more that way. I might be able to get a snap ring in there. I don't know if you can make that out. The billet's so shiny. There you go. You can see it there. So we'll try to get some snap rings in it, see if that doesn't work. Okay, you already know. Got that icon. Harbor Freight hit me up. We'll talk about it. There's ones here. See if you can't get these snap rings in there. Looks like that one's seated. We'll flip it over. You can tap them with a screwdriver too once you get them in to make sure they seat properly, but you'll see the lip sit down in there. There we go. Yeah, so I think I might try to hit this back just a tiny bit. So see if you can see that. It'll focus. I don't know if it's going to focus or not. There's a little tiny gap, and I could have cleaned those rings a little bit better, but there's a little tiny gap between the ring and that bushing. So I'm just going to take that mallet there and that socket I was using and tap on this side. I might pull that ring out and just try to move it, you know, a few centimeters just to get it a little bit more seated on this end, because this one's not all the way seated. You can see the snap ring sticking a little bit out. So we'll go ahead and do that now, and we'll go from there. All right, way better. Got them both seated in there pretty good. So you can see the snap ring sitting in that little channel on both sides. So we'll get the other side knocked out, and then we'll get it in the machine. We'll pick up from there. All right, guys, we got it over here at the machine now. One thing I'd like to point out is these are different, and they're directional, obviously, like anything. See how that's got a little hump in it on the end there, right here? So that goes out towards the wheel assembly, and this side here is smooth. That goes in towards the radius rod plate. There's no bump in it. You see that? So, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong if I have these backwards, but I mean, you can see how it's parallel with that upper radius rod. And if it's spun around the other way, you get kind of a weird angle look to it, to where it's not as uniform or parallel. So keep that in mind. Again, if I'm wrong, you'll correct me. So don't forget your little spacers. I've seen people do that before. Doesn't really go together that well, which I'm surprised it goes together at all like that. It's possible though. You'd be surprised. Make a lot of ruckus back there, clanging and banging. So put this one on up here. Spacers are going to be a pain in the butt. Need a hammering device. We'll wiggle this one down into place in the back here first. Sometimes with these plates, they need a little persuasion. Like so. Like so. Bolting. You betcha. Best way to protect the threads is to hammer it through. So just remember that. If you're worried about flattening threads, grab a hammer, punch it through. Only real way to protect them threads. Up next, we got this side. This side kind of seems like there's a little bit of a lip. I might smooth that out with a grinder real quick. Yeah, it looks like it's biting on it. Let me grab the grinder. Oh yeah, way better. So I got it all mounted up here. Skipped ahead a little bit. So this one here on the radius rod plate, that one's kind of a pain to get to. The transmission's right in the way. The best way I've found to do it is to leave the bolt mostly out, just enough to where there's one or two threads sticking through on the other side of this. Reach down there with your fingers, pinching the nut. Get it started by fingers, and then snake a longer wrench down in between the transmission and that plate, and to get on that nut, and then you can hit it with a few ugga-duggas from the big impact. It's on 3, nothing crazy. Just want to make sure that plate's snug. And then that one went in smooth after I got ground down those burrs that were on it. It went right up in, and we tightened her up. Now we're gonna get this wheel and tire on so we can get this thing on the ground and we can start going over a few things. So I'm gonna do that now. Got the tire mounted up. Using the 3/8 stubbies, which, by the way, if you don't have one of these and you're a Milwaukee guy, you're sleeping, bud. Thing's a unit. Guaranteed to rip. All right, we'll get this thing on the ground. All right, car's back on the ground. Radius rod's installed. Looks good. So I think I'm going to wait until next episode to go over what's all done to this thing. Just being that for editing's sake, keeping myself sane, and my computer's memory size-wise, I guess you'd say, I got to keep them shorter. Anyhow, and that might change. But I will go over real quick what all happened at Hammers. I'll insert a few pictures, I guess, of the kind of terrain out there for those that have never been out there. I mean, you can easily search it on YouTube's, but we'll go over what happened. So while I was down there, I did happen to break one front axle, which is guaranteed to happen no matter where we go. I don't run RCVs or Turners or any of those big name guys yet. Reason being that I've ran all balls, 8 balls axles. They're cheap and they're under $200, and Rocky Mountain takes care of me on them as far as warranty, it seems like. This last time I did have a little bit of an issue, and I've only broken about 4 of them in the front so far. And this one honestly wasn't even my fault. I didn't come down under power or anything like that. I was simply trying to get out of a trail for an Ultra 4 car. I was backing up. I had the wheel turned all the way one way to the right, and as I was backing up, he didn't wait, and he went up and over my tire. As it was spinning backwards, he drove up and over it, spun it back the other way, snapped that axle. No big deal. Whatever, that one broke. That's the first thing on the list. Second thing on the list is I did have a little clutch issue. I can get the cover apart and I could show you, but there's a snap ring on the 18 and older models, and on 19 ups, they did a snap ring delete from the factory. A lot of guys actually get the kit for their older machines. Anyhow, the input shaft or the output shaft of the trans, however you want to look at it, still has that groove for that snap ring. And I had a washer that had wallered out, and it was catching on that lip and not letting the secondary disengage all the way or spread all the way apart. So I had that little issue. That kind of kicked things off. First thing when I got there, I felt like this machine was well underpowered, especially for what it is here in the Midwest. Again, we'll go over what's all done to it in the next video, but I felt like it was super underpowered. First thing when we got there, I was complaining to a buddy of mine. Actually, I said, this thing feels terrible. It feels like a turd. I said, I don't know if it's the elevation, the lack of elevation, or what it is, but something's not right. And I chalked it up to that clutch issue because that's what I discovered first off. So fast forward a couple days, we're riding, and I'm wide open on the lake bed, and I was like, man, this thing will not go over 52 mile an hour. So what's going on? So yeah, it wouldn't go over 52. And the RPM, you would start out, you'd hit 8,800 RPM. It'd be real linear. And then it would start trickling off. The RPM would start falling off. It would fall all the way off into the 6,000s for RPM. Before you know it, you're doing 40 and you're still flat-footed. So I was like, okay, something's obviously broke, right? Or not good. So we get it back to camp. At first I was like, maybe I got some bad fuel. I started checking that out. I started digging into it, and the first thing that I noticed is the spark plugs. I have only changed spark plugs on this machine twice since having it. Currently, it is sitting at, let's see, $1,600 miles. So 1,600 miles, I've done 2 sets of plugs. I did have this car on E85 at one point in time. That was the only reason I changed the plugs. So after I switched back from E85, I kicked those plugs and put a fresh set in it. So it's got 1,600 miles, and it's only had 2 sets of plugs in it. I don't know if that's common or what, but I mean, a lot of these guys racing them, I mean, they're blowing through plugs. I definitely don't treat it nice. It's not 1,600 miles of putting around a field, or I mean, it's 1,600 of a lot of wide open. And I also, I'll run for whatever for fuel in it. I'll run 87, whatever's available. I mean, you get to some of these places like Black Mountain and Waynoka and S'more, and it might be hard to find 91, 93. So I just put 87 in it and whatever. So that was my first thought, was plugs. So we got a set of MR9F NGK plugs. We actually had to call O'Reilly's, and they had to get a set there overnight because nobody in Hammertown had a set. A few tents, reputable companies, I checked with them, asked them if they had spark plugs, and they said, why would we have spark plugs? Don't know, man. That seems pretty common. But anyhow, put a set of plugs in them. Got the plugs, gapped them to .02. Put them in the car, started it up. It seemed like it was running a little better. I still wasn't sold that it was strictly plugs. So I continued to inspect the car just to make sure. Next thing I found was my charge tube had a hole in it. Now, I'll insert some photos here, but this bar is bent, and it was rubbing on my charge tube. This is an RPM silicone charge tube. It had rubbed a hole through it. So what I ended up doing was taking the tube off. I had a tire patch with tire cement. I ground down the tube, put that cement on it, put the patch on it, and then I ended up duct taping it, and it held. It was no longer leaking. That is what is in this box over here, is a new charge tube from RPM. Without a problem, they sent me a new one. Like I said, no fault of their product. Actually, my fault. Due to rollovers, this bar is bent and touching. From the factory, this bar is straight, and it does not touch that charge tube. So I get that charge tube patched up, put it back in the car, take it out for a spin. It seems to be running great. I think problem solved, right? We go out. We probably get 20 minutes from camp. The car's fully warm, and it starts running on one cylinder. It sounds like a 4-stroke dirt bike at this point. I'm like, man. So problem's clearly not fixed. Limp it back to camp. Start diving into a few things. I think it's fuel related or spark related. Obviously, we just put new spark plugs in it. I pull the spark plugs out. I test them on the cylinder head while somebody's cranking it. I got spark. I put a fuel pressure gauge on the injector rail, test fuel pressure. It had 50, or actually it had 80 PSI. And I think Polaris says around 50 is what the pump should put out. So I'm like, okay, maybe we got a bad pump or a clogged filter or something like that. And you could hear the pump die out. Well, we had a spare pump laying around, so we swapped out the pumps, put a newer pump in it. It was holding 52 PSI perfect. Pulled the injectors out. I ran some brake cleaner through them. That seemed to have helped a little bit. Still just running on one cylinder. So that leads me to my next point. I got home from Hammers. I mean, I didn't get to drive it any further than that, really, because that was the most we could do in the desert was what we had done. So I get back to my home. I started tearing into it. First things I noticed was when I took the spark plugs out, one of them, if you could see this would have been cylinder 1, and this would have been cylinder 2, right? So one of them is super clean, and one of them is not. So I'm like, okay, maybe that cylinder's not getting fuel. Maybe the injector's clogged. So I took the injectors, the rail off the intake, and had somebody just cycle the key to see if the injectors were spraying while the injectors were still in the rail. And it seemed like this one, cylinder 1, was not spraying, which would make sense why this plug is so clean. So I'm like, okay, maybe I got a bad injector. So I swapped the injectors around, and then still that cylinder 1 wasn't spraying. I'm like, okay, then there must be an issue with the wiring. So I get my voltmeter, and both of them have good voltage to them. I'm like, well, that's weird. So at this point, I pull the plugs out. I crank the motor. Cylinder 1 was full of fuel, plumb full of fuel. I'm like, okay, well, clearly that injector's spraying. So maybe it was just like a fluke deal that when I cycled the key that injector didn't spray. The test on the injectors did come back. One of them was clogged. I'll insert a picture of the chart, the flow chart. But we got the injectors back. They're clean. They flow the same. Lot cheaper. If you guys need injectors clean, you can get a hold of me. I got a buddy that does it. He does it for a fair price. I mean, especially being that those injectors, I think, are like $130 if you can even get them. They were discontinued for the longest time. So we got the injectors back. They're clean. They flow the same. They're freshened up. I think at this point, I have a coil on the way and spark plug wires. So I'm just doing a process of elimination. I'll put the injectors back in. I don't think that's the issue. Obviously, if one was clogged, it wouldn't be filling a cylinder full of fuel. So I think that there is a issue with either that coil or the plug wire. And what leads me to believe that something might have happened to that is this car has a aftermarket Assassin's launch control set up on it. Did. One of the wires got melted, right? And when we were doing a diag, I originally thought, I was like, oh, perfect. That's what's going on, is one of these wires got melted. And there's a wire on those launch controls. One goes to the transmission, or one goes to the crank sensor, one goes to the coil. So, and they're just like jumper harnesses. So it was plugged into that coil. So that very well could have shorted out that coil. It's hard telling, but we got a new coil coming. It's supposed to be here next week sometime. We'll get that slapped in. We'll get the cleaned injectors put in, and we'll put new plug wires on it. And I think that that's going to take care of my issue, though. But I got to wait for those parts to come. They should be here, like I said, next week, and we'll get this thing buttoned up. We'll also, probably end up doing at that time a walk around of what else done in the machine. But I think that's going to be where we leave it off today. We'll pick back up when we get the parts in, and we'll see you next time.